us remember where we were on 9/11, right? I mean, there are some days in our lives which are etched into our memories. And today, I can say I will remember I was on News 9 on Liberation Day. Because honestly, I what I am describing this entire action is as a self goal. At the end of the day, these kind of tariffs not only on countries that are, say for example, messing with the global order in some way, but literally countries which are friendly nations, countries. I mean, what is the point of putting a 45% tariff on Myanmar? I mean, what is Myanmar exporting to the US? At the end of the day, what does a country like Myanmar after its earthquake even have? So a lot of the countries which are actually in Annexure 1 of the presidential declaration are highly impoverished countries from the African Union. Then there are East Asian countries which are, facing very high rates like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Philippines. I mean, all the East Asian countries which were once called the East Asian miracle, if you remember, there was this entire, narrative around that, and how the US actually was the reason why these countries became the East Asian miracle. They are facing rates between 35 to 45%. And actually, I would say India has got a pretty decent deal at 26, 27%, because what they're sort of observing as India's, main rate of tariff to the US comes from the agriculture sector, because the idea is that the US really wants to dump a lot of its corn and cornstarch into India and, change India's eating habits. And we are resisting that. And I think that that is very fair. So I would take a 26% tariff for Indian exports any day. But honestly, I mean, what is the point of putting a rate like 10% on Russia or 10% on Latin America, and then Canada and Mexico, which right at the beginning of this entire exercise were the biggest offenders, so to speak, are actually excluded from this entire tariff policy, where he's honoring where he's honoring the most favored nation
Right.
status. So, it's confusing for
Shri,
everyone.
I mean, it's confusing for everyone simply because there is not enough details, isn't it? He's not given sector-specific tariffs. He hasn't, explained as to, for example, pharmaceuticals. We don't know whether these new tariffs will apply on pharmaceuticals or not, and already, there is already so much confusion regarding the tariff rates. And here you have Trump saying that the 26%, and bear in mind this 26% tariff on India is on top of the 10% baseline tariff, which means technically India's imports into the US, Shri, will get taxed at 36%. And that is quite steep, and he calls it kind.
So, Krishna, yes, there is a lot of global consternation, anger, disappointment at what President Trump has done. But just to, say one thing before we move on to the impact on India. See, I think if I were to see things from President Trump's point of view, Mithali is very upset and asking why should he be imposing such tariffs on even smaller countries which actually are impoverished. But I think the larger point that President Trump is trying to make is that the fiscal path, the balance sheet which the US has today, the amount of debt the country has on its books is unsustainable. So the fixing of the US and the economy and its balance sheet has to begin at some point. And he's decided that the easiest thing would be to start making some money from global trade, because US is the largest consumer of most items around the world. And by US's own projection, this is going to yield them some $800 billion in tariffs. Okay, so that's one thing. Now the question is, who pays for, from whose pockets is this $800 billion going to come? I think the answer is fairly simple. It's going to come from the pockets of American consumers, unless the exporters figure out a way to reduce their own costs and supply at the previous landed price despite the new additional tariff, which is a very steep ask. It doesn't usually happen. But coming back to India and its impact, so yes, there is going to be a huge uncertainty. There are many aspects of India's own growth which will be impacted. The larger point I want to make, Krishna, is that India is not really an export-dependent economy. We are, of course, we are very healthy exports, not just of goods, but also services. But if you look at the combined merchandise bilateral export between India and US, it's only 3%. So it's not something that's going to really hit us badly, for example, as China, because now China, don't forget, is going to be paying 54% because 34 plus the previous 20%. And some analysts estimate that it could even be higher than 54%. So China is really going to be the one that bears the brunt of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. On India, there are a couple of direct and indirect impact. One is, of course, our exporters need to figure out how do we, deal with this additional tariff. Are there efficiencies they can eke out in their own manufacturing processes that allows them to cushion some of these tariffs to an extent so that the importers in the US continue to buying from us, and only part of this tariff impact is felt by the American consumers. That's number one. Number two, the larger point, which is about what the impact of these tariffs will be on US itself, which is it's going to slow down the American economy. There's already talk of stagflation, recession, slower growth for sure, higher inflation in the US.
Right.
So if the US economy slows down, all the other global economies which are dependent on US as a market will also necessarily slow down. So that's another thing. Finally, Krishna, I think we also are working on a bilateral trade agreement with the US, and we are committed to completing it, let's say, by August or September this year. So there is another track which the government is pursuing. So in the interim, we need to see how there certainly will be some, pain in the export market. But I guess India, from a relative point of view, will be less affected than some other export-dependent economies like China.